The ceiling lights of Northgate Urgent Care flickered twice as the glass doors flew open, and the snow came in with 9 men in black suits. No ambulance, no sirens. Only 3 battered SUVs still steaming in the lot outside, in the middle of a February blizzard in Charlestown, Boston, and the man leading them tall, in a long black wool coat he never bothered to button, a pale scar running along his jaw, carrying the youngest of his men in his arms. His name was Raphael Vitale, and in that city nobody ever said his name louder than a whisper. There were only 2 people on duty that night, a front desk clerk shaking too hard to hold a pen, and Adeline Cross, the night nurse, a woman who years earlier had her license stripped away by a board in Philadelphia and had been called 3 words she still heard in her sleep. She stood frozen for exactly 1 breath. Then she pulled the marker from her scrub pocket, walked to the man nearest her, and did the one thing she had forbidden herself to do for all those years. She took command. She ordered the 2 men still standing to press down on their friend's wound. She ordered the clerk to hold the flashlight steady and not to cry. And she ordered Raphael Vitale, bleeding from the shoulder, and telling her he was fine, down onto the floor, to hold his best friend's head straight and not move a single inch. He obeyed. For 2 hours, the most powerful man on the Boston waterfront knelt on cold tile and followed every word of a woman whose name he did not know. All 9 of them lived. Then, when the last one was breathing steadily again, he stood up, took 3 steps, and collapsed at her feet. Adeline saved the 10th man too. 3 days later, 3 different SUVs pulled into that same lot. This time they had not come for help. They had come to ask her one question. The one question she had never dared answer herself. Why would a woman the medical system had crushed and thrown away spend 2 hours keeping alive the very men this city wanted to see put down? If you believe a person deserves a second chance, leave a like, drop a comment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with us. 7 hours before that glass door burst open, Adeline Cross was driving down Rutherford Avenue with 1 windshield wiper that refused to move. The one on the right had died sometime in the fall, and she still hadn't taken the car in to have it fixed. So whenever the snow thickened across the windshield, she leaned to the left, pressed her shoulder against the driver's door, and watched the road through the narrow fan-shaped patch the wiper on her side could still clear. She had been driving that way all winter. She knew exactly where the pavement dipped, which traffic light lagged half a beat before changing, and where she had to slow down because of a pothole the city had promised to repair the year before. A person could get used to almost anything when there was no other choice. On the passenger seat sat a canvas purse with both handles worn thin, and inside it, tucked between a hardbound notebook and a half-empty tin of mints, was an ivory envelope with the stamp already affixed. There was no return name in the upper left corner, only the recipient's address, written by hand, a house on Green Street in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. Inside was cash, folded once in half, with no letter. This was the 72nd envelope. She had dropped the first one into a mailbox at a gas station outside the city, her hand still trembling, and every month since then she had done the same thing, as regularly as someone taking medicine. That money hadn't come from nowhere. Her engagement ring had been sitting behind the glass of a pawn shop on Chestnut Street for so long that she could barely remember the last time she had seen it, and she had never gone back to look. Her mother's car, a moss green sedan that Ruth Ann, her mother, had driven for 20 years, had been sold to a man who paid cash in a church parking lot, and Adeline had stood there watching it turn the corner before walking home. On weekends, while other people went to football games or took their children out into the snow, she picked up shifts in the morgue of a funeral home in Somerville, doing the work no one wanted to do, for people who no longer needed anyone's help. She told no one about it. Her phone buzzed as she turned into the Northgate parking lot. It was Bernadette Kowalski, whom everyone at the station called Birdie, her voice rough and raw as though she had either just finished shouting at someone or started smoking again after quitting 3 times. She said the road leading out of her neighborhood was buried in snow up to the axles. The tow trucks were tied up in Somerville, and she wasn't going to make it in before daylight. Then she went quiet for a beat, and added that Adeline had better not take another double shift, that 30 years in the profession had taught her one thing. The human body knew how to keep a debt, and one day it would come to collect. Adeline told her she sounded exactly like her mother. Bertie said that was why she was saying it. At night, Northgate was only half alive. Meridian Health Group had begun pulling its funding from the facility at the start of winter, and it had done so in exactly the way corporations usually did, which meant it hadn't shut the place down outright. It had simply cut away piece by piece, until the place could die on its own. 3 examination rooms in the back had been locked. The staffing board had gone from 14 names to 4. The illuminated sign above the entrance still said "Open 24 hours," because taking it down would cost money too. And all the equipment from the old emergency department, everything that hadn't yet been moved elsewhere, had been packed into a storage room at the end of the east corridor, behind a steel door with an electronic lock and a strip of blue security seal printed with the corporation's name. Adeline had been the last person to sign the inventory sheet before that door was locked. She still remembered the code, and she had written her name in the final box in the same slanted handwriting her mother used to say looked like the handwriting of someone who knew what she was doing. The receptionist working with her that night was only 22, had been on the job for 6 weeks, and still had the habit of greeting every patient by both first and last name. She handed him a container of noodles from the microwave and told him to eat before the weather got any worse. Beyond the glass doors, the snow had begun falling sideways instead of down. It was a sign Adeline had learned over 3 Boston winters, a sign that meant the wind had shifted and that this night wasn't going to be like the others. She hung her coat on the hook, tied her hair back with the rubber band she kept in the drawer, and clipped a felt tip marker into the pocket of her lab coat the way she had done for years, never knowing that only a few hours later she would use that very marker to draw lines across the chests of 9 men she had never seen before. 9 men lay across the tiled floor of an emergency station that was only half alive, and Adeline stood among them, counting, then counting again, until she understood something she didn't put into words for anyone in that room. There was nothing in her hands, nothing in that building, that was enough to keep all 9 of these men alive until morning. The on-duty supply cabinet held gauze, IV fluids, and the kinds of things meant for someone who sliced a hand while chopping onions at midnight. It hadn't been designed for a night like this one. She asked why they hadn't kept going to a larger hospital, and the tall man in the black wool coat answered her in 3 very short sentences. The bridge behind them had been completely blocked, and none of the vehicles could turn around. Any emergency department at a major hospital would be required to call the police when several people arrived injured at the same time in circumstances like these. And inside the 3 vehicles smoking outside were things that, if the police saw them, would mean these 9 men would never go home again, whether they lived or not. Adeline didn't ask another question. She turned, walked down the east corridor, and stopped in front of the steel door at the end. The blue security seal was still intact, printed with the name Meridian Health Group, and the date the room had been closed was written in black ink near the bottom corner. She stood there for the length of 1 breath. Exactly 1 breath. And within that breath, she saw with perfect clarity everything that would come afterward. An incident report, a meeting, a sheet of paper placed in front of her with an empty space waiting for her signature. And the profession she had once been forced to crawl on her knees to win back would be taken from her a second time. She entered the code. The door opened with the rasp of hinges no one had touched in a long while, and the blue seal tore cleanly in 2, falling to the floor like an old ribbon. Inside was everything Meridian had decided this place was no longer worthy of keeping. 3 portable ventilators still sealed in their boxes, a small refrigerator filled with IV fluids, chest decompression kits, factory sealed and unopened, arranged in 2 rows on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. She pulled an entire supply cart out into the corridor, its wheels squealing across the tile, and she didn't look back at the door even once. When she returned to the lobby, she pulled the felt tip marker from the pocket of her lab coat and began doing the kind of work no school could teach, the kind only sleepless nights could teach. She moved from one man to the next, bending down, looking, touching, and drawing marks across the fronts of their shirts. 1 line for the man who could wait, 2 lines for the man who had to be treated immediately, 3 lines for the man she would return to first if anything changed. She finished all 9 in less time than it took for a song to play, and when she straightened, the entire room had fallen silent with her, including the large men standing nearby with no idea what to do with their hands. The youngest man lay closest to the door, and there were 3 lines across his shirt. His name was Tobias Renner. He was 24 years old, and Adeline knew because she had asked, and she had asked because she wanted to hear how much breath he still had left in his voice. His lips had begun turning a shade of gray she had seen exactly 4 times in her life, and all 4 times had been in rooms that smelled of disinfectant. She knelt beside him, opened the kit she had just taken from storage, and did what had to be done. Then she sat still, one hand resting on his chest as she counted the rhythm, watching the gray recede from his lips, little by little, until they returned to the color they belonged on a 24-year-old man. She didn't cheer. She simply moved to the next person, Raphael Vitale was kneeling on the cold tile a few steps away, both hands holding his closest friend's head straight, exactly as she had ordered him to do, and he had remained in that position for so long that the knees of his trousers had darkened with melted snow. The man in his hands was Gideon Marsh, 46 years old, and he was trying to say something no one could make out. Rafe looked up at Adeline and asked whether she knew who she was touching. Adeline didn't lift her head. She said she was touching a lung, and told him to keep his hands exactly where they were and not move. When the last of the 9 men was breathing steadily, and the young receptionist had sunk down onto the floor at the foot of the counter, with the flashlight still glowing in his hand, Raphael Vitale rose from the tile, slowly lifted his hands away from Gideon Marsh's head, as carefully as someone setting down something fragile, took 3 steps toward the door, and collapsed. Adeline heard the sound of a body hitting the floor before she had time to turn, and she knew immediately who it was, because there was only one person left in the room who didn't have marker lines across his shirt. She pulled back the collar of his wool coat and saw that the fabric beneath his left shoulder had been dark for a long time, so dark that it was almost impossible to distinguish from the black of the coat itself, and she understood that he had been standing there for 2 hours, while knowing exactly what condition he was in. She called over the 2 men who were still able to stand, and had them carry him onto the old examination table in room 3. The one with a piece of pressed wood wedged beneath one leg because the floor had settled, and she worked beneath the light of a desk lamp instead of the ceiling fixture, because the electricity to that section had been shut off since the fall. He woke partway through. He didn't startle, didn't ask where he was, didn't try to sit up the way men like him usually did. He simply opened his eyes and looked at her. Adeline kept her head lowered as she finished what she was doing, needle and thread beneath the dull yellow light, and she told him that if it hurt, he should say so, because she didn't have anything stronger to give him than what she had already injected. He told her it didn't hurt. She said everyone said that. He was quiet for a long while, then asked whether she intended to ask him any questions. Adeline replied that all she wanted to know was whether he was allergic to any medication, and that every other question fell outside her job. And for the rest of that time, Raphael Vitale lay still on the examination table with one uneven leg, watching the woman stitching his shoulder, and realized that this was the first time in his life anyone had looked at him without seeing his name, without seeing the harbor, without seeing the things people whispered about him over dinner tables in the North End, and had seen only a shoulder that needed to be put back together. Bertie Kowalski arrived when dawn was close, her hair wet with snow, road salt still clinging to her boots, and she stopped dead at the threshold of the east corridor. She didn't look at the 9 men. She didn't look at the supply carts. She looked at the steel door at the end of the hall, looked at the 2 halves of the blue security seal lying on the floor, and stood there for a very long time with her mouth slightly open and no sound coming out. 30 years in the profession had given her enough words for almost everything, except this. The convoy left when the world outside had turned the gray of a morning that hadn't quite begun. The 9 men were helped into the vehicles. Gideon Marsh was wrapped in a blanket, and one of them nodded to Adeline as he passed. She nodded back. Raphael Vitale was the last to leave, his left hand resting loosely inside the pocket of his unbuttoned coat, and before stepping outside, he placed a thick envelope on the reception counter, setting it down very gently, as though he had done this hundreds of times, and no one had ever refused. Adeline picked up the envelope, followed him 3 steps, and pushed it back into his hand before he reached the door. He looked at her. She said nothing. He took it, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and walked out into the snow. On the tiled floor of Northgate Emergency Station, 9 dark stains remained, along with a felt tip marker that had run out of ink. The meeting took place the following afternoon in the second-floor boardroom at Northgate, a room that, since Meridian had begun pulling its funding, was opened only once a month, and where the whiteboard still carried the numbers from the previous quarter, because no one had bothered to erase them. Adeline arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a gray sweater instead of her uniform, and sat in the chair they indicated for her, the one at the end of the table nearest the door. Across from her sat the facility's executive director, a man she had greeted every morning for 3 years and had never spoken to for more than 2 sentences at a time, along with the head of human resources, and between them sat a third person she had never seen before. He introduced himself as legal counsel for Meridian Health Group, wore a charcoal suit with seams as sharp as a paper cutter, and possessed the kind of politeness that sent a colder feeling down a person's spine than any shout ever could. The politeness of a man who knew with certainty that he was going to win, and therefore had no reason to raise his voice even once. He called her Miss Cross. He asked whether she had slept well after a night like that. He poured her a glass of water before pouring one for himself. Then he opened his leather briefcase, and everything began. Not one person in that room mentioned the 9 men. No one asked whether they were still alive, what their names were, or whether they had made it home. The meeting wasn't about that. The meeting was about a blue security seal printed with the corporation's name, about a steel door at the end of the east corridor, about 3 portable ventilators and a refrigerator of IV fluids, and a medical kit that had been removed from its original packaging, all of them assets in the process of liquidation that had been sealed according to procedure, and about an unauthorized nurse who had taken it upon herself to unlock that door using a code that should have been deactivated when the inventory was handed over. The legal counsel said that he deeply appreciated what had happened that night, that he personally didn't question her motives for a single second, but that the corporation had obligations to its shareholders and that procedures existed to protect people exactly like her. Then he placed a sheet of paper on the table, turned it so that it faced her properly, and slid it toward her along with a pen. On that sheet, written in language so polished that it had to be read twice before its meaning became clear, she was being asked to acknowledge that she had acted alone, outside the scope of any directive, without the authorization of any supervisor, and that she accepted full responsibility for breaking the seal and for any consequences arising from that action. Bertie Kowalski shot to her feet. She stood so quickly that the chair behind her scraped against the tile, and she drew in a breath to speak, loud enough that everyone in the room heard it. Adeline didn't look at her. She simply reached over, rested her hand on Bertie's wrist, and gave the slightest downward pull. That was all. A very gentle tug, almost tender, the gesture of someone who had sat in rooms like this too many times and knew exactly that one more sentence would only cost the person speaking something else, and knew that the person about to lose it wouldn't be her. Bertie sat back down. Adeline read the paper from the first line to the last, slowly, twice, in a silence no one dared disturb. Then she set the pen down on the table, pushed the document back to the center, and said she wouldn't sign it. The legal counsel nodded as though that were an entirely reasonable answer, closed his briefcase, and said that he understood, that she had the right to consult an attorney of her own, and that in the meantime she was being suspended from duty, pending the outcome of the review. He wished her a pleasant afternoon. Adeline walked down the stairs, left the building, and climbed into her car at the farthest corner of the parking lot. She turned the key. The engine gave 3 dry coughs and died. She tried again, then stopped. Snow began falling once more, spreading a thin layer over the windshield, then a thicker one, and she sat there without moving, both hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the world outside slowly blur behind the white until darkness settled completely, and the tall parking lot lamp above her switched on by itself. 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of the apartment building above the laundromat on a morning when the sky had not yet fully brightened, and the man who stepped out of the first vehicle was already waiting on the sidewalk when Adeline opened the door. He carried nothing in his hands. He addressed her by her last name, said that someone wanted to speak with her, and opened the rear door of the middle vehicle. No one touched her. No one said another word for the entire drive, and Adeline sat watching the city slowly recede behind her, across the bridge, past industrial districts that were still closed for the morning, then along a narrow road following the shoreline, where winter waves struck the rocks and built gray shelves of ice against the base of the seawall. Nahant in February was nearly deserted. The iron gates opened before the vehicle had fully stopped. The house stood at the end of a gravel drive so long that it took nearly half a minute to reach it, and it looked nothing like the things people usually imagined when they thought about money. There were no white columns, no statues, nothing displayed for anyone to admire. It was simply old and right. Gray granite quarried from the region itself, a black slate roof, floor-to-ceiling windows facing directly toward the restless sea, and a row of cypress trees trimmed flat along the drive, without a single stray branch, even in the middle of winter. She was led into the foyer and invited to sit in a leather armchair beside the fireplace. The floorboards beneath her feet were wide planks polished by years of use, the kind of wood a person couldn't simply order over the phone. On the mantel lay a watch face-up, its dial white, its leather strap worn nearly through at the 3rd hole. The sort of watch no one would pay more than a few dozen dollars for if it were put up for sale. It was the only thing in the room that looked as though it belonged to an ordinary person. A woman brought her a cup of coffee on a saucer, then withdrew, leaving Adeline alone with the sound of the fire and the waves. The door to the room on the left stood open by about the width of a hand. She couldn't see anything inside, only a strip of light falling across the wooden floor and the shadow of a table leg. but she could hear. The first voice belonged to an older man, and he was speaking very quickly, talking over himself as he explained something about a shipment, about a third man who had made him a promise, about the fact that he had 4 grandchildren, and a loan he hadn't finished paying. And with every sentence his voice broke a little more, until it no longer sounded like the voice of a grown man. Then there was a silence, and after that silence came a second voice. It didn't rise. It lowered. It dropped so low that Adeline had to hold her breath to hear it. And what sent the cold along her spine wasn't what the voice said, but its rhythm, the calm rhythm of someone discussing the weather. The voice asked the old man whether he wanted to lose the warehouse or lose his name in this business. It added that he was allowed to choose only one, and that it would wait. Then there was nothing else. No noise, no chair falling over, nothing at all. Only a silence that lasted long enough for Adeline to hear the wood crack in the fireplace and the waves outside. The door opened afterward, and the older man came out holding his knit cap against his chest, the way a person held a hat at a funeral. His face drained white all the way to his ears. He walked past where she sat, less than 2 steps away, and didn't dare look at her even once. He didn't look at anyone else either. He went straight to the front door, and someone closed it very gently behind him. Raphael Vitale came out about a minute later. He wore a white shirt with no tie, and his left shoulder was still slightly stiff when he moved, the shoulder she had stitched beneath the desk lamp in room 3. He didn't speak right away. He stopped in the middle of the foyer, lifted his right wrist, and refastened the cuff link that had come loose, doing it slowly and precisely. His eyes lowered to his wrist until it clicked back into place. Then he looked up at Adeline, and when he opened his mouth, he spoke to her in exactly the same voice she had just heard, that low, even voice, not half a note louder. He said he had a few questions he wanted to ask her, and that he hoped she would answer truthfully, because he already knew most of the answers. The room he led her into wasn't an office, but a small library overlooking the sea, and on the long wooden table in the center of the room lay a thin file, the edges of the papers aligned down to the last millimeter, the kind of arrangement made by someone accustomed to working with documents rather than people. The woman who had prepared it stood by the window, around 40 years old, her hair tied low, a wool coat draped over one arm, and Raphael Vitale introduced her as Corinne Vance and said nothing else about her. He opened the file and slid each item toward Adeline slowly, one after another, like a man dealing cards. 3 Philadelphia newspapers, their edges yellowed with age, all original print copies rather than screenshots, and on an inside page of each was the same employee identification photograph of her, the face of a woman far younger than she was now, a woman who still had no idea what was about to happen to her. Beside them was the order suspending her license to practice, stamped and dated, specifying a period of 18 months, though guilt had kept her from ever attempting to reinstate it, since with a single line, explaining the reason in the cold administrative language she had read so many times that she knew every comma by heart. And finally there was a sheet of paper that was almost blank. Corinne Vance spoke for the first time to explain that page. She said there had been a settlement agreement connected to the incident at Sacred Heart Hospital, that it had been created at the time, that it had been sealed by court order, and that none of its contents could be accessed through any avenue she knew. She said she had tried 3 different approaches, and all 3 had stopped at exactly the same place. The only thing she had been able to obtain was its outer cover, a page listing the case number and filing date, with 2 signature boxes at the bottom. Both boxes had been signed. Both signatures had been blacked out. Corinne Vance said that in 11 years of doing this work, this was only the 2nd time she had ever had to tell the person who hired her that she couldn't go any farther. Raphael Vitale didn't ask Adeline what she had done. That was what made her lift her head. He didn't ask whether she had switched the medication, didn't ask whether she had been drunk, didn't ask whether she had fallen asleep or slipped outside for a cigarette. The questions she had been asked in every possible form, in rooms of every possible size, for years. He sat on the edge of the table with one hand resting on his knee and asked her something entirely different. He asked why someone who had been crushed by that very system and thrown into the street would still spend 2 hours keeping 9 men alive when half the city would have preferred to see them fall. Adeline was silent for a long time. Outside the window, a wave struck the stone seawall and burst into white spray. Then she tugged the sleeve of her sweater a little farther down, without realizing she was doing it, the small motion hiding the faint scar running along the outside of her left forearm, the scar she had gotten during her final shift at Sacred Heart, when she reached out to catch a falling instrument tray without having time to think about what was lying on it, and then she said something she had never told anyone in this state. She said that night she had checked the batch of IV fluid 3 times. Not once, as procedure required, but 3 times. Because something about the code printed on the label had made her uneasy, and she had reported it, and they had told her to continue. She said that after the 3rd check, she had taken the pen from her pocket and copied the entire lot number into her notebook, along with the date, the time, and the name of the person she had reported it to. She said that when everything fell apart, no one asked her about that notebook. Not once. Not through the entire process. And she said that notebook still existed. Raphael Vitale watched her for a long time after that last sentence, and Adeline realized he didn't believe her. It wasn't that he thought she was lying, he simply hadn't decided yet. And he was the kind of man who wouldn't decide until he had looked long enough. He stood, walked 3 steps toward the window, then turned back and placed an offer on the table. His 9 men needed someone to look after them until they could stand on their own again. She had no job, and she had a car that wouldn't start. He would pay her 3 times her old salary. He would make sure the suspension file at Northgate stayed quiet, and in return, she would live in the east wing of the house until the last man got out of bed. He said it in the voice of someone discussing a shipping contract. Adeline understood perfectly well that it wasn't kindness. It was the way a man like him kept something he didn't yet understand within sight. Adeline had been gone from the room for quite some time when Corinne Vance opened the 2nd file, the one she had deliberately kept off the table while an outsider was still present. She said she had reconstructed the entire night on the bridge, and that it wasn't anything like what everyone in this house had believed. Casper Lund hadn't sent men out there to kill anyone. If that had been what he wanted, he wouldn't have chosen a night with a snowstorm, wouldn't have chosen a refrigerated freight truck carrying real license plates, and wouldn't have chosen a stretch of bridge with 3 Department of Transportation cameras pointed directly at it. He had chosen all of those things because he wanted a vehicle stopped, not a body. He wanted 30 seconds with the rear door of the middle SUV. He wanted a briefcase. Raphael Vitale sat without moving and listened to all of it. And when Corinne Vance said the word briefcase, he stood, walked into the adjoining room, and returned carrying the very object she meant, a dark brown leather case worn at the corners, the one he had carried out of Logan Airport and into the vehicle that night, before throwing it onto the floor without giving it another thought. There was no money inside. There was nothing a man like Lund could have sold to anyone. Inside was only an appraisal report, about 2 finger joints thick, its cover printed with the name of a real estate consulting firm in Quincy, and on the first page was an aerial photograph of a waterfront warehouse at the end of a dead-end road in the southern docks, a long block of gray concrete with a sheet metal roof, 3 roll-up doors, and a painted sign so badly faded that only the final 2 words could still be read. Pier 4. Rafe had bought it for the simplest reason in the world. It stood exactly where he needed it. It was cheap because the owner wanted a fast liquidation, and one side of the property bordered a deep water channel that no other warehouse within 3 miles could offer. He had sent people to inspect it, paid for the appraisal, signed the offer letter, and had never once set foot inside. Corinne Vance said she had spent 2 days tracing the warehouse's chain of ownership, because it was the only direction left after every other path had closed. She turned to the final page of the appraisal, the page listing the legal entity that owned the property and the person authorized to sign on behalf of the seller, then rotated the sheet toward him so he could read it. The warehouse belonged to a subsidiary of Meridian Health Group, where the corporation stored paper records from facilities it had already closed, and the person signing on behalf of the seller was the chairman and chief executive officer of that corporation. Raphael Vitale read the name on the page, then reached to his left and pulled toward himself the only cover sheet Corinne Vance had been able to obtain from the sealed settlement agreement in Philadelphia, the page with the 2 blacked-out signature boxes that no one had been able to open. At the top of that page, above the redacted section, was a line identifying the first party to the agreement. That line hadn't been blacked out. He placed the 2 sheets side by side on the long wooden table beneath the light coming through the windows that faced the sea, and he read them both again from the beginning. Everett Halloway, the same name. Outside, the waves continued striking the stone seawall in the same rhythm they had kept all morning, and no one in the room said anything for quite a long time. Corinne Vance was the first to speak. She asked whether he wanted her to dig deeper into Halloway. Rafe didn't answer that question. He asked her another one instead. He asked what would have happened if Lund's men had managed to take the briefcase that night on the bridge. And Corinne Vance replied that the acquisition would have collapsed, because losing the appraisal documents would have meant missing the offer deadline, and the warehouse would have been sold to someone else within a matter of weeks. Rafe nodded very slowly. He looked down at the 2 pages lying beside each other one more time, then looked toward the hallway, toward the east wing, where the woman who had been sitting in that very chair less than an hour earlier was now being shown the rooms of the 9 men she had kept in this world. The east wing had originally been left empty, with 3 guest bedrooms and a long sitting room with glass doors running the entire length of one wall, and within 2 days it had become something Adeline herself couldn't quite name. Not a hospital, not a home, but something somewhere in between. The beds were moved against the walls exactly the way she instructed. She had all 3 potted plants taken out into the hallway because she didn't want soil in a room where people were healing from wounds. She taped a large sheet of paper to the front of the cabinet at the head of the room, divided it into 9 columns, and wrote a name at the top of each one. That was the first thing that made the 9 men look at one another. In the world they lived in, people called each other by shortened names, by the neighborhoods where they had grown up, by nicknames that had clung to them after some old story even they could no longer remember. And there were men who had spent 10 years beside each other without ever hearing anyone call them by the name their mothers had given them. Adeline didn't use a single nickname. She asked each man, wrote it down, and from then on she called them exactly that way. Tobias Renner, Gideon Marsh, Reuben Salt, and the other 6 names in full, every time she took a blood pressure reading, every time she changed a dressing, every time she told someone to sit up. That evening, she took the hardbound notebook from her purse, the notebook she had carried with her from Philadelphia and had never left anywhere for more than one night, turned to the first blank page after the old ones, and wrote the 9 names down in a vertical list, adding the date, their condition, and the numbers only she knew how to read. She did it as a 30-second habit before turning out the lights, without thinking, the same way someone locked a door before going to bed. Gideon Marsh was the most difficult case, not because of his wound, but because of the kind of man he was. 46 years old, smoking since before he was legally old enough to buy cigarettes, and during the first 3 days he found 3 different places in the house where he could sneak away and smoke. Adeline found all 3. The 4th time, she didn't say anything at all. She simply placed the image from his lung scan on the breakfast table, directly in front of the seat where he always sat, with the printed side facing upward, then walked away. Gideon Marsh sat staring at it throughout breakfast. By noon, he handed her the rest of his pack of cigarettes and his lighter without saying a word, and she put them into the drawer of her desk without saying a word either. 3 days later, he began finishing his morning porridge instead of pushing it aside. On Saturday afternoon, a young woman came to visit. She was 19 years old. Her name was Nell Renner, and she wore a red puffer coat and a knit cap with a pom-pom on top, carrying against her chest a tin box tied with a ribbon that had slipped slightly crooked during 2 separate bus rides. She was Tobias's younger sister. Inside the box was an apple pie she had made herself, and the first thing she said from the doorway was that the crust had burned a little at one corner, but the rest was fine, that she had tried a piece at home and knew for certain it was safe to eat. Tobias Renner sat up in bed, one arm still in a sling, and tried to open the box with his other hand. He turned it around. He wedged it between his elbow and his ribs. He tried biting the ribbon with his teeth and missed. Nell stood watching her brother struggle with the tin for nearly a full minute before she burst out laughing so hard that she had to sit down on the edge of the bed, and Tobias tried to keep a serious face while laughing along with her, and the sound of the 2 of them carried all the way out into the hallway, a sound the East Wing had never held since the day the house was built. Adeline opened the box for them. Then the 3 of them sat along the wide window ledge, eating pie from paper plates, watching snow fall onto the gray sea outside and disappear the instant it touched the water. Nell said their father was doing much better, that he had walked out to the mailbox by himself, that the week before he had even argued with the neighbor about clearing the snow, and she told the story with the expression of someone who considered an argument good news. Tobias watched his sister as she spoke and didn't say anything. He only watched her. Adeline sat at one end of the window ledge, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had already gone cold, and realized that it had been a very long time since she had sat in a room filled with laughter, without being the person standing outside, looking in. Of the 9 names written on the sheet of paper taped at the head of the room, there was one Adeline had to look at the man's face before she could remember, and that name was Reuben Salt. He was 31 years old, the least seriously injured of all 9, with only a wound along his ribs and a sprained wrist, and he had been walking on his own since the 2nd day. In her line of work, people like him usually passed through memory very quickly, because a nurse's memory was built around the people who were about to be lost, not around the people who were going to be fine. That was also exactly why she had developed the habit of writing those 9 names into her notebook every night. Because she had learned a very long time ago that people only forgot the names they had never written down. On the 11th night, she was making her final round when she noticed that the door to the linen storage room at the end of the hallway was slightly open, with a cold blue light spilling out beneath it. She pushed the door open. Reuben Salt was standing with his back to the hallway, a small phone resting in his palm, the kind of flip phone people didn't use to call their families. He heard the door and turned around, and in that instant Adeline saw everything pass across his face. Not anger, not calculation, but something almost like relief. The expression of a man who had spent days waiting to be caught. He didn't run. He didn't take a single step toward her. He placed the phone on the shelf, opened his hands so she could see them, then sat down on the only plastic chair in the room and said that he was the one who had sold the convoy route to Casper Lund. He said it had started 2 summers earlier, that the first payment had been so small he had convinced himself it didn't count as anything at all, and that by the 4th time there was no longer any way back. He said that on the night at the bridge, he had sent the departure time and the vehicle number from the airport parking lot, then climbed into the 3rd SUV, and he had believed the whole thing would end with them being stopped for 30 seconds. He said he hadn't known there would be ice on the road that night. Adeline stood with her back against the doorframe and said nothing, then asked him only one question. She asked why he was telling all of this to her, someone who had no authority at all in this house. Reuben Salt looked down at his hands for a long time. Then he said that on the night at Northgate, while he was lying on the tiled floor and everything inside his head had begun to slow down, a woman had bent over him and called his name. She hadn't called him Buddy. She hadn't called him Hey. She had called him by his name, his full first and last name, 3 times, and told him not to go to sleep, told him to answer her, told him there were 8 other men lying there, and she didn't have time to come back a 4th time. He said he had lived 31 years in this world, and no one had ever called his name that way before, the way someone called when they genuinely needed him to still be there. He said that since that night he hadn't been able to send another message, that he had written and deleted the last 3 messages, and that the one she had just caught him typing was the message telling the person on the other end that he was done. Adeline didn't call security. She told him to stand up and follow her, and she led him down the east corridor, through the sitting room, and into the library overlooking the sea, where the lights were still on even though it was well past midnight. Gideon Marsh was sitting there with Raphael Vitale. Reuben Salt started from the beginning and left out nothing, and when he said the name Lund, Gideon Marsh shot to his feet, the chair falling backward behind him, and he made it a step and a half forward before Rafe's hand closed around his wrist and held it there. Rafe didn't stand. He simply kept his hand around Gideon's wrist, his eyes still fixed on Reuben Salt, and told his old friend in that low, even voice that the man hadn't finished speaking, and that he was going to sit down. Gideon Marsh sat down. Over the next 2 hours, Reuben Salt told them everything he knew about Casper Lund, the shipments, the names, the 3 docks to the north, the middleman who received information at a tire repair shop in Chelsea, and even the one thing he himself had found strange, that this time they had paid him 5 times the usual amount simply to provide the departure time of a convoy traveling from the airport, and that he had never understood why. Raphael Vitale listened to all of it without interrupting once, and when the sky outside the windows began to change color, he stood and told Reuben Salt to go back to his room and get some sleep. The meeting was arranged through exactly 3 people, and the location was an old seafood warehouse in South Boston, a place where no shipments came in at this time of year, so the entire storage area inside was as cold as the air outside. The concrete floor dusted with a layer of white salt, empty iron hooks swaying gently in the draft, slipping through the gaps beneath the roll-up door, and the smell of the sea soaked so deeply into the walls that there was no way to scrub it out. 2 wooden tables had been set in the middle of the warehouse, about 4 steps apart, with no chairs at all. Raphael Vitale arrived first, and stood at the table on the right, both hands resting lightly on the wood. Casper Lund came later, 50 years old, tall and lean, his silver hair cropped close, wearing a navy wool coat that belonged to a man who had truly spent time at sea, not to someone who merely liked looking as though he had. Each side had 4 men standing behind their leader, exactly 3 steps back, their hands held in front of their bodies, and throughout the entire meeting, not one of those 8 men moved more than once. No one drew anything. That was the rule at meetings like this, and what made them frightening wasn't what people carried inside their coats, but the fact that everyone knew perfectly well those things were there. Rafe spoke first. He didn't offer a greeting. He said that on the night at the bridge, 9 of his men had ended up on the tiled floor of an emergency station staffed by only 2 people, and that among those 9 was one man who, if help had come even a little later, would now have a funeral taking place in Dorchester. Casper Lund started to open his mouth. Rafe lifted 2 fingers from the surface of the table, only 2, and Lund fell silent. Rafe continued. He said he didn't care what Lund had intended to take that night, didn't care whether there had been ice on the bridge or not, didn't care about anyone's intentions, because in this business no one got paid for intentions. Then he said what he had come there to say. He said that one of Casper Lund's 3 northern docks would stop operating before the end of the week. He didn't say which dock. He didn't say how. He didn't ask whether Lund agreed, didn't offer a trade, didn't mention compensation, and didn't look around to see how the 4 men behind Lund reacted. He delivered the sentence exactly the way someone announced a train schedule. A silence settled over the warehouse long enough for them to hear water dripping from some pipe in the back. Casper Lund remained still, both hands still resting on the table, and he didn't object. He had lived long enough to know when an objection would only turn the number 3 into the number 2, but he didn't remain silent. He looked at Raphael Vitale, tilted his head slightly, and said that he would take the loss of the dock, that he wouldn't complain once, but in return he wanted to tell Rafe something, and he wanted to tell him because he believed Rafe didn't know it yet. Lund said he hadn't come up with the bridge job himself. He said someone had approached him first. Someone had put up the money first, and that person hadn't wanted a briefcase. That person had wanted Raphael Vitale put down. He had wanted it to happen within a specific window of time. He had wanted it done before Rafe could complete a deal he was already in the middle of. Lund said he had refused that part. He said he had accepted only the vehicle stop and the theft, because he had been in this business for 40 years and had never taken that kind of job, and that he wasn't telling Rafe this out of kindness. He was telling him because he didn't like the idea of someone sitting in some office somewhere believing they could buy him to do that kind of work. Rafe asked for the name. Casper Lund said he didn't have one. He said the money had come through 3 layers, and the only thing he knew was that it had come from a place with a great many lawyers. The meeting ended there. No one shook hands. Raphael Vitale returned to the vehicle, sat in the back seat, and didn't say a single word to anyone during the entire drive home. He sat looking through the window as the rows of warehouses along the southern docks slid past in the fading afternoon light, and inside his mind he began placing 3 things beside one another: a deal still unfinished, a place with a great many lawyers, and a name he had seen twice on 2 different sheets of paper during the same morning. The northern dock stopped operating on Friday afternoon, exactly as Raphael Vitale had said it would in the seafood warehouse, and Saturday night was the answer. Rafe left for Quincy that afternoon with a small escort of guards, leaving all 9 recovering men under Adeline's care. At the house, only 2 guards remained at the gate. The woman who handled the kitchen had gone home early. None of the 9 injured men could yet put on a coat without help, and there was Adeline. She was sitting at the small table at the end of the sitting room, writing the final lines in her notebook when the hallway lights went out. They didn't flicker. They didn't dim. They went dead all at once. At the same moment, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen stopped, and in that sudden silence she heard something she would hear again in many nights to come: the sound of gravel on the driveway, grinding beneath several pairs of feet at the same time. She didn't scream. She stood, walked 3 steps into the middle of the room, and said in a voice just loud enough for all 9 men to hear that everyone was going down to the basement, right now, and no one was getting out of bed on his own feet. The basement stairs were at the end of the east hallway, 17 narrow steps. She stripped the sheets from the beds, folded them lengthwise, slid them beneath each man's back, and tied the ends together into rough slings, then dragged them across the wooden floor one at a time, one man's head almost touching the heels of the man ahead of him. She placed the 3 heaviest men on the food cart with 4 rubber wheels that was normally used to carry trays from the kitchen to the dining room. The wheels squeaked. She remembered there was cooking oil in a kitchen drawer, poured a little onto the axles with the back of her hand, and the squeaking stopped. Above them, on the ground floor, there were already footsteps. Not one person. Footsteps carried clearly through the wooden floors of an old house when heard from a basement, clearly enough for Adeline to count how many people there were and which direction they were moving, and she used that very thing to decide when to drag the next man across the open stretch of hallway. By the time the last man reached the foot of the stairs, there was the sound of breaking glass in the kitchen above. Tobias Renner was standing on the 4th step from the bottom, one arm still in a sling, and he refused to come down. He told her the basement door opened outward, so barricading it from inside wouldn't be enough. Someone had to stay there. Adeline looked at him for exactly 1 beat, then stopped arguing because she had run out of time. She dragged the steel medicine cabinet from the corner of the basement, a cabinet so heavy she had to shift it by tipping one edge at a time, and wedged it against the foot of the stairs, along with 2 wooden crates filled with canned food and an old armchair someone had left down there years ago. Then she switched off the only light still burning in the basement. The darkness inside the basement of a stone house was a solid kind of darkness, with no shade or depth to it at all, and inside it there was nothing left except sound. The breathing of 9 men, each with a different rhythm, and Adeline listened to every one of them the way someone listened to an orchestra that had fallen out of tune. One man began breathing faster, broken and shallow, and she found him in the darkness by counting her steps from the bottom of the staircase, placed one hand on his shoulder, pressed down gently, and told him in a voice already gone rough that he had to breathe with her. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slower, slower still. She stayed standing. She didn't sit down, didn't kneel, because standing meant she could hear the entire basement, while sitting meant she could hear only one man. Above their heads, the footsteps moved from one end of the house to the other twice, stopped for a long time directly over the basement ceiling. Then something was overturned, and the footsteps moved again. At one point they stopped directly above the stairwell, and Adeline heard Tobias Renner hold his breath on the 4th step. She said nothing. She kept her hand exactly where it was on the shoulder of the man breathing too quickly, and continued counting the rhythm for him, steady, not even slightly faster. Then the footsteps moved away. Then came the sound of vehicles on the gravel drive. Then there was nothing. No one in the basement dared move for a very long time after that. Rafael Vitale's vehicle reached the gate, while the basement was still dark. He didn't stop on the ground floor, didn't stand there looking at the kitchen, didn't ask either of the gate guards a single question. They heard him running down the east hallway, heard the medicine cabinet scraping across the concrete floor, and then he reached the bottom of the stairs and someone switched on a flashlight. In that dull yellow circle of light, he saw all 9 of his men lying along the walls, still alive, and in the middle of the basement stood a woman with her hair coming loose from its tie, one hand pressed to a man's shoulder, her mouth still counting the rhythm in a voice that had almost completely given out. She looked up at him. Rafael Vitale stood at the foot of the stairs and didn't take another step. And in that exact moment he understood something he wouldn't tell anyone for a very long time. 3 days later, Adeline learned the news from a short item on a local health page she was reading while waiting for the kettle to boil, only 4 lines long, saying that the medical director of Meridian Health Group had been hospitalized and had temporarily stepped away from his duties for health reasons. She had mentioned that name exactly once in this house. Only once, on the morning in the library overlooking the sea, when she told them who she had reported the IV fluid batch to that night. She walked down the east hallway, passed through the sitting room, and pushed open the library door without knocking. Rafael Vitale was standing by the window with a stack of papers in his hand. She asked whether he had sent someone to see the man. He set the papers down on the table, turned to look at her, and didn't deny a single part of it. He said someone had gone to see him, that the person hadn't touched him, that the man had heard only one sentence and one name before collapsing in his own office. Then he added that he had done the thing she would never have had the nerve to do, and that she ought to be thanking him instead of standing there. Adeline took 2 steps forward and slapped him. The sound cracked through the high-ceilinged room, dry and thin, and both guards outside in the hallway heard it. She didn't step back. She told him that, for all these years, she had lived inside an official report that said she was the kind of person willing to hurt someone else to save herself, and that she had spent all that time proving the report wrong. She said that just now, in only 3 days, he had turned her into exactly the thing they had written. Then she turned her back and walked out. Rafael Vitale remained alone in the middle of the library, one side of his face still burning, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't find a single thing to say. Corinne Vance arrived on an afternoon with no sun, and this time she brought no file with her, only a sheet of paper folded into quarters inside the pocket of her wool coat. She said there had been 2 leaks, not one. Reuben Salt had sold the departure time and the vehicle number. That much was clear. But the information the other side had obtained about the Pier 4 deal, the fact that there was an unfinished acquisition, and the exact deadline attached to it, was something Reuben Salt could never have known well enough to sell. Only 4 people in this house knew about it. Corinne Vance read the first 3 names aloud, then stopped, and Rafael Vitale said the 4th name for her, Dorsey Fallon, 52 years old, the longest-serving driver in the house, The man who had held the steering wheel for Rafe's father before he ever held it for Rafe. The man who still wiped the windshield himself every morning with a cotton cloth he washed separately at home because he didn't trust the kind people bought in stores. And the man who had carried Rafael Vitali out of the funeral home on the day of his mother's burial, when Rafe was still a teenage boy who didn't yet reach the man's shoulder. Rafe didn't have anyone summon him upstairs. He went down to the garage. Dorsey Fallon was sitting on the plastic chair beside the roll-up door, the cotton cloth draped across his knees, and when Rafe walked in, he didn't stand the way he always had before. He only looked at him, then lowered his eyes to his own hands, and spoke before Rafe had time to ask. He said he was the one who had told them. No one had interrogated him. No one had threatened him. No one had paid him a single cent. He said a man in a suit had approached him in the parking lot of a hospital in Brookline, called him by his last name, and knew exactly which room his daughter was in. Then Dorsey Fallon told the rest in the steady voice of a man who had rehearsed the words inside his head for many nights. His daughter was 21 years old, in her 3rd year of college, and sometime earlier the doctors had found that she had a disease so rare there were only 9 known cases in all of New England. There was no standard treatment protocol. There was no approved medication. The only thing left was a clinical trial group that was still enrolling patients, and that trial was funded by Meridian Health Group. He said he had submitted her application 3 times, and she had been rejected 3 times because of one criterion, then another. Lines of language he didn't understand and didn't know whom to ask about. He said the man in the suit had asked him only one question that day, whether he wanted his daughter's name on the list for the next enrollment round. Dorsey Fallon said he had thought about it for 4 days. He said he had counted and recounted what exactly he was about to sell, and he had told himself that he was giving away only a name and a deadline, nothing more, not a route, not a person. Then he said that on the night 9 men lay across the floor of that emergency station, he had sat in this garage from the moment he heard what had happened until morning, and he hadn't been able to stand up. He said that if Rafe wanted him to write everything down, he would write it, and if Rafe wanted something else, then there was nothing more for him to say. Then he fell silent. Rafael Vitale hadn't said a single word through any of it. He pulled the second plastic chair from the corner of the garage, placed it beside Dorsey Fallon, and sat down. The 2 men sat next to each other in the cold garage, staring straight at the closed roll-up door, and neither of them spoke for so long that the light outside shifted from gray to almost dark. At one point, Dorsey Fallon lifted a hand to his face, then lowered it again. Rafe didn't look over. He sat with both elbows resting on his knees, and inside his mind were none of the things a man in his position was supposed to be thinking. He thought instead about how a man had driven for his family for all those years, and Rafe had never once asked what his daughter's name was. Then he stood. He told Dorsey Fallon to go home, to go be with his daughter, and not to come back here again. That was all. There was no other sentence, no promise, no accusation. Dorsey Fallon nodded, folded the cotton cloth into quarters, placed it on the plastic chair, and walked out toward the gate, beneath a sky that had gone completely dark. Rafael Vitale stood in the garage watching until the man disappeared from sight. Then he picked up the cloth, and he remained there for a very long time with it in his hand. Corinne Vance had gone to the house on Green Street a week earlier, had knocked on the door, had handed over her business card, and had the door closed in her face by a 74-year-old woman in less than half a minute. And when she told the story afterward, she added that it was the first time in her career she had ever been refused that way, meaning without anger, without fear, simply with the closing of a door. Adeline went alone. She took the earliest train, changed trains in New York, and reached Germantown in the early afternoon, walking from the station up Green Street past rows of attached red brick houses in the old Philadelphia style, each with its own stone steps. The snow on them shoveled neatly in the particular way. Only people who had lived there for years ever seemed to manage. The house she was looking for stood near the end of the row. She had written this address on 72 envelopes, and had never once seen it with her own eyes. She stood at the foot of the steps for quite a while before climbing them. The old woman opened the door after the second knock. She was short, her back slightly stooped, her white hair cut close, and she wore a gray cardigan buttoned all the way to the throat. She stood there and looked Adeline up and down exactly once. Adeline opened her mouth to say her name. The woman raised one hand and stopped her. Then she said she knew who Adeline was, that she had recognized the handwriting around the 11th or 12th envelope, the slant of the letters and the way the first letter of the street name was capitalized, and that from then on, every month, she would pick up the envelope and look at it for a while before carrying it into the house. She said she had been waiting, not waiting for the money, waiting for the person with that handwriting to come and knock on her door. Then she opened the door wider and told Adeline to come inside, because it was cold out there. The living room was small, with a low ceiling and faded floral wallpaper, and in the corner, against the wall with no window, stood an upright walnut piano with its top open and a cloth loosely draped over the strings. Beside it a bench and a worn green felt tool tray with tuning wrenches arranged from largest to smallest, not one of them missing. Odette Bright poured tea for both of them, then sat in the armchair across from Adeline. She went to a cabinet and brought back a flat wooden box, the kind piano tuners used for keeping replacement strings, set it on the coffee table, and opened it. Inside were 72 ivory envelopes, arranged in 2 stacks, all still intact, all slit open neatly along the top edge with a knife. She said she hadn't spent a single dollar of it, not because she didn't need it. She said she had used that money exactly once, many years earlier, to pay a lawyer downtown, a decent man who had listened to her for 2 hours and then told her that her story made sense, but she didn't have a single piece of paper to prove it, and that if she took it to court, she would lose this house. She said she paid him, thanked him, walked to the bus stop, and from that day forward she had kept the rest of the money in this box and hadn't touched it again. She said she didn't need money. She needed someone willing to stand up. Adeline sat without moving. She had prepared one sentence in her head, only one, revising it again and again throughout the train ride, and now she said it. She said she had come there to ask Odette to forgive her. Odette Bright looked at her for a very long time. Then she said there was nothing to forgive. She didn't add anything after that. She stood, went into the next room, and when she returned, she was holding a small notebook bound in brown leather, its edges worn smooth, the kind that could fit inside a shirt pocket. She placed it in Adeline's hands. She said her husband had tuned pianos for 46 years, and that he had a habit of writing down every wrong note he heard, wherever he happened to hear it, in churches, in restaurants, in other people's living rooms, because he always said that human ears forgot, but paper didn't. She said that during the days he had been lying in that hospital, he had kept writing. Adeline opened the notebook. The first pages were filled with musical notes and markings she didn't understand. Then, around the middle, the handwriting changed, became more widely spaced, and the entries were no longer about music. There were the things a man lying in a hospital bed had heard from the hallway outside his room, written down exactly as they had been spoken, according to the lifelong habit of a man who had made his living with his ears. A string of numbers printed on a label that 2 people outside the door kept repeating. A name, a sentence someone had said to someone else, that this couldn't leave this floor. And on the final page that contained writing, there were only a few lines, the pen strokes trembling so badly that the letters no longer joined together. Adeline stared down at that page for a very long time. Odette Bright sat across from her with both hands resting on her knees, and she said she had kept this notebook all these years, tucked into a drawer beside her husband's reading glasses, and that she had always believed the day would come when someone would ask her about it. Then she said the last thing she said no one ever had. The name written in the brown leather notebook, the name a man lying in a hospital bed had heard through the doorway and copied down according to the habit of a lifetime, belonged to a pharmacy technician, Marisol Quintero. It took Corinne Vance half a day to discover that the woman had left the profession, moved out of Pennsylvania, and was now living in Providence, Rhode Island, working part-time at an office supply store. Adeline took the train down the next morning, alone, the notebook tucked inside the pocket of her coat instead of her purse, because she didn't want it away from her body for even a minute. The apartment was on the ground floor of a 3-story wooden building on Amherst Street, with wooden steps and a broken doorbell, so Adeline knocked. The woman opened the door about the width of a hand, 41 years old, her hair tied back in a hurry, one hand still holding a dish towel, and the moment she saw a stranger, her face closed in the way Adeline had seen on the faces of so many people throughout her life. Adeline didn't give her name. She didn't explain where she had come from. She simply raised the brown leather notebook to eye level, opened it to the exact page where the number printed on the label had been written down, and held it there. Marisol Quintero looked at the notebook. She didn't take it. She stood there with the dish towel in her hand, her eyes moving along the string of numbers, then reached out to grip the doorframe, and sank down onto the wooden step right where she stood, sitting heavily as though she had just walked far too long. She stayed there for a long time without saying anything. Then she asked where the notebook had come from. Adeline told her the name of the man who had written it. Marisol Quintero closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she told Adeline to come inside. There wasn't much furniture in the apartment, only a small dining table with 2 chairs and a low wooden cabinet, and on top of the cabinet were photographs of several children laughing at some birthday party in a backyard. Marisol Quintero went into the next room, pulled out a plastic storage bin with tape across the lid, the kind people used when moving houses, and peeled the tape away with her fingernails. Inside were papers. She took out a stapled packet, 3 pages long, yellowed at the edges but still intact, and she said she had photocopied it on the last night she was still working inside that building, folded it beneath her clothes, carried it through 3 moves, and shown it to no one all these years because she had 2 children and no one standing behind her. It was the inspection report for the batch of IV fluid. On the second page was the exact same number that appeared in the brown leather notebook. And beneath it was the conclusion, written in dry technical language, confirming that the batch had failed inspection and needed to be recalled from circulation. The date on the report was 11 days before the night Adeline Cross's life had been broken in 2. At the bottom of the 3rd page were 2 signature boxes. The first held the signature of someone Adeline had never heard of. The second contained only a capital letter, a period, and a last name. S. Voss. Adeline looked at the name and didn't understand. She had seen it before. She knew with certainty that she had seen it somewhere, many times, but it wouldn't attach itself to any face in her memory, and she kept staring at those 3 letters, as though they belonged to a language she had once known, and then forgotten. Marisol Quintero said the full name aloud. She said the person who had signed the second box was Dr. Sinclair Voss, who at the time had been the deputy department chief, the youngest person ever to hold that position at Sacred Heart, and that after everything had settled down, he left the hospital, began using his mother's surname, and continued practicing medicine in another state, under a different name. Then she said that other name. Adeline said nothing. She didn't stand, didn't put a hand over her mouth, didn't ask her to repeat it even once. She remained still on the wooden chair in the small Providence kitchen, both hands resting in her lap, staring down at the 3 letters written in the final box of a yellowed sheet of paper. For all those years, that name had passed before her eyes more times than she could count. On local medical news, on the brass plaque in the lobby of a building she walked past every week, in the 4 lines she had read while waiting for the kettle to boil less than a week earlier. She had been looking at it all those years and had never recognized it once. Outside the window, a bus stopped at the corner of Amherst Street, then pulled away again. Marisol Quintero poured her a glass of water and set it down in front of her, and she didn't say anything else either. The 3-page inspection report Marisol Quintero had kept inside a plastic bin through 3 different moves was the thing that finally opened the door. Corinne Vance had been standing in front of with nowhere left to go, because once there was a copy in hand that existed outside the sealed record, the settlement agreement was no longer a completely closed block, and within 4 days, Corinne Vance had found a way into Meridian's internal archive, the paper repository where the corporation had sent the records of every facility it had shut down to wait for destruction. In that index were the names of hospitals Raphael Vitali had never heard of, and one name he had heard all his life: Everett General Hospital, the place where his mother died. He sat alone in the library overlooking the sea for the entire evening with the file from that night on the table before him, and he read very slowly, because he had lived for nearly 20 years with one version of that night, and now another version was lying beneath his fingers. He had always believed they refused to admit her. He believed it because he could still remember standing at the intake desk and speaking louder than he needed to, could remember someone telling him to sit down, could remember the orange plastic bench along the wall, and the feeling of being a teenage boy sitting there staring toward the double doors. No one came through, but that wasn't what the file said. She had been admitted. There was an intake form bearing the name Rosalia Vitali, with the time recorded, the symptoms recorded, the priority level recorded, and at the bottom of the form was the signature of the person who had received her, a nurse, 23 years old. He kept reading and found the staffing roster from that night, and he sat staring at it for a very long time. The emergency department at Everett General had 3 nurses on the floor that night for an area that, by the hospital's own internal standards, should have had 7. Not because anyone had called in sick, because it was the 2nd month of a staffing reduction approved by the administration, and the file even contained the memorandum authorizing that reduction, written in the polished language of people who never had to stand inside an emergency department at midnight. His mother had been placed in the waiting group. She remained in that group for a length of time, no document recorded, and she died while waiting for her turn. No one had refused her. That was the part Raphael Vitali had to read 3 times before he could make himself believe it. There had been no one standing at the desk saying no. There had only been a signed form, a name on a list, and not enough people to reach every name on that list. Then he turned to the final section. After that night, there had been an internal review, and the review concluded that the cause lay in an inaccurate priority classification at intake. The 23-year-old nurse was suspended. Her written statement was in the file, 3 handwritten pages, and Rafe read every one of them. She wrote that she had escalated the condition of the patient sitting in the outer waiting area twice that night. She wrote that she had asked for more staff and had been told there was no one available. She wrote that she had gone back to that waiting area 4 times during her shift. The handwriting on the 3rd page grew smaller toward the end and crowded in on itself as though the person writing it was afraid of running out of paper. She never returned to nursing. The memorandum authorizing the staffing cuts had 2 signatures at the bottom, and Rafael Vitale had seen one of those signatures twice on the same morning not long ago, once on a real estate appraisal, and once on the cover page of a sealed settlement agreement. Everett Halloway. Back then, he had been younger, still a mid-level operations administrator, and even his signature had been more careful than it was now. Rafe sat motionless in the library with 2 sheets of paper separated by nearly 2 decades, lying beside each other beneath the desk lamp. And the first thing he thought about wasn't Halloway. The first thing he thought about was that his entire life had been built on the wrong story. He had gone through all those years believing the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those with power and those who got turned away, and that the only way to make sure no one ever turned you away was to become someone no one dared say no to. He had built everything he had on that belief, but no one had told his mother no. A staffing sheet had killed her, a staffing sheet approved by someone sitting far away, and that person hadn't known she existed and had never needed to know. Then he thought about the 23-year-old nurse who had signed his mother's intake form, the woman who had escalated the case twice, who had gone back 4 times, who had been named in a final report and had never worn that uniform again. And he thought about the woman sitting in the room at the end of the east hallway of this house, the woman who had checked a batch of IV fluid 3 times, who had reported it and been told to continue, who carried in her purse a notebook no one had ever asked about. The same system, the same method, the same signature at the bottom of the page. Rafael Vitale remained there until the desk lamp was the only light still burning in the entire wing, and during all that time he came to understand that if he did what he had done all his life, if he went after Everett Halloway and ended this in his own way, then that staffing sheet would still be there, and somewhere, on some night, in some place, he would never even hear the name of. Another 23-year-old nurse would sign another form. Adeline didn't make it back to Boston that night. She left the apartment on Amherst Street after the sky had already darkened, started walking toward the station, and at the second intersection, a car pulled up tight against the curb in front of her. No one said anything to her. Someone simply opened the door, and another man stepped into place behind her, and she understood that standing there, arguing on an empty street in Providence, wasn't going to lead anywhere. She got into the car. She kept the brown leather notebook inside the pocket of her coat, pressing it against her ribs with her elbow, and for the entire 2-hour drive she didn't say a word. They took her to a warehouse in the northern docks, a place that smelled of machine oil and salt water, and left her sitting on an iron chair inside a room with a window overlooking the black water. No one touched her. No one asked her a question. Someone brought her coffee in a paper cup, set it on the table, and walked out, and she left it there until it had gone completely cold. Rafael Vitale arrived before dawn. He drove there alone. No convoy, no one beside him, no one standing outside the door, and he walked into that warehouse empty-handed, wearing the same long black wool coat that fell below his knees, unbuttoned as always, while Casper Lund's men stepped aside and watched him pass, with no idea what to make of the sight. Lund was waiting at the far end of the warehouse beside a long wooden table. Rafe didn't offer a greeting. He didn't look toward the room with the window. He placed a prepared stack of papers on the table, opened it, turned it the right way, and pushed it toward Casper Lund. Then he said the thing that no one along the harbor believed when the story was repeated afterward. He said that the entire northern shipping line, every dock, every union contract attached to it, everything his father had left him, and the most profitable part of everything he owned, belonged to Casper Lund as of that morning. He said he wanted nothing in return. He was keeping only one thing, an abandoned warehouse at the end of a dead-end road on the southern docks that he was still in the process of buying. Casper Lund read the papers twice. Then he looked up at Rafael Vitale with the expression of a man trying to find the trap and failing to find one. And finally he asked whether Rafe understood what he had just done. Rafe told him to sign. Lund signed. He signed with the face of a man who had just been handed a fortune for nothing, by someone he would never respect again. And then he told his people to open the door to the adjoining room. Adeline came out. She walked between two silent rows of men without looking at anyone, and by the time she reached the warehouse door, the eastern sky had begun to brighten, a pale gray streak across the water. He opened the car door for her. For half the drive back to Boston, neither of them said anything. Then Adeline turned and looked at the side of his face beneath the passing glow of streetlights moving backward across the glass, and she asked him why. Raphael Vitali kept his eyes on the road ahead, both hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't answer. The news came the following afternoon, and it came from the broker handling the transfer paperwork for Rafe, a man in Quincy, who was simply calling to say that the seller was clearing out the warehouse before the handover date, and that if the buyer wanted to inspect the current condition, he should come down sometime that day. Adeline heard him say it because she was standing right beside the table. She said she was going with him. Rafe didn't stop her. Pier 4 stood at the end of a dead-end road running along the water, and when they arrived, two enclosed box trucks were already parked one behind the other in front of the roll-up door, their rear doors open, while a crew in reflective vests pushed stacks of cardboard boxes out along a hand-operated conveyor. The side of each truck carried the name of a document destruction company. Everything was being done according to procedure. There were clipboards, someone checking each item against an inventory, complete paperwork, because this wasn't anything secretive. It was simply what corporations did every year with records the law no longer required them to keep. 7,000 paper files from facilities that had already been closed. And standing in the middle of it all, wearing a camel-colored cashmere coat, a clipboard in one hand, personally supervising the operation, was a 59-year-old man Adeline had only ever seen in photographs until that day. Everett Halloway. No one had started the fire. The warehouse had stood unused for years, and in the farthest section, behind the shelving, a row of industrial solvent drums, left behind by a previous owner, had never made it onto any inventory list. One of the two old forklifts still operating inside had deteriorated electrical wiring. It happened very quickly, and there was no great explosion, only a sharp pop and a burst of yellow light in the farthest section, followed by smoke. Thick black smoke from burning solvent that rose to the metal roof, spread outward, and then began sinking lower. The crew was outside in less than a minute. Halloway wasn't. He went the other way, back inside toward the third row of shelving, and people heard him shouting some inventory code, and then came the long scrape of metal across concrete as an entire shelving unit, twice a man's height, tilted and crashed down. Adeline stepped toward the roll-up door. Raphael Vitali caught the collar of her coat from behind and pulled her back. He pulled hard, with his whole arm, and for 1 second she was spun completely around to face him. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. She simply raised her hands and peeled his fingers away from her collar one at a time, slowly, without hurrying, and all the while she kept her eyes fixed on his. Then she released his hand and turned back toward the warehouse. Raphael Vitali didn't stop her a second time. He remained at the threshold of the roll-up door with his hand still half closed in the air, and he let her go. Inside, the smoke had already dropped to chest level, so Adeline bent low, covered her mouth with her scarf, and moved along the left wall, where the draft from the open door was still pushing some of the smoke aside. She found him at the third row. The fallen shelving unit had come down across his legs, and it was heavy, so heavy that she tried lifting it twice before giving up and changing her approach. She found an iron stock bar lying on the floor, wedged it beneath the edge of the shelving, then drove her entire body weight down on the other end until the rack lifted about the width of a hand. He managed to pull his legs free. He couldn't walk. Adeline slid both arms beneath his armpits, locked her grip, and dragged him across the concrete toward the door, moving backward 1 step at a time, each step less than 2 feet, and every few steps she had to stop to catch her breath, because the air at that height had already become difficult to breathe. About halfway out, she passed a stack of cardboard boxes the workers had abandoned in the aisle. She stopped. She read the code printed on the lid of the top box. Then she shifted her grip, holding Halloway with one arm wrapped across his chest while the other arm clamped the box against her hip. And she continued that way for the rest of the distance. By the time she reached the open air, 3 people ran over and took Halloway from her. She let them. She set the cardboard box down on the wet pavement, sat on top of it, and lowered her head between her knees to breathe. Raphael Vitali stood about 5 steps away, and he didn't look at Everett Halloway even once. He looked at the woman sitting on top of a box of records, and in that moment, something inside him ended, and something else began. The review hearing of the Pennsylvania State Medical Board opened on a late spring morning in a conference room on the 4th floor of an administrative building in Harrisburg. A room with a low ceiling, a gray carpet worn thin along the center aisle, and 8 chairs arranged in a straight row on the raised platform for the members of the board. Adeline sat at the petitioner's table, wearing the only charcoal blazer she owned, both hands resting flat on the tabletop. To her left lay the 3-page inspection report, its paper yellowed with age. To her right lay the brown leather notebook. Marisol Quintero was called first. She spoke in a quiet, even voice, without looking down at her notes a single time, describing how she had photocopied that report on the final night she was still inside that building, how she had carried it through 3 separate moves. And when one of the board members asked why she had remained silent for all those years, she paused for a moment and said that she had 2 children and no one standing behind her. No one asked another question after that. The brown leather notebook was placed on the board's table and passed from hand to hand among all 8 members. It was the thing that kept the room silent the longest, because it wasn't evidence in the sense those people on the platform were accustomed to working with. It was only the pocket notebook of a piano tuner who had written down what he heard from his hospital bed, and on the final page were a few lines written in a hand, trembling so badly that the paper had to be tilted beneath the light before the words could be read. Odette Bright sat in the front row, wearing the dark blue wool coat she reserved only for the most important occasions. Her back straight, both hands folded over the purse resting in her lap. She didn't say a single word throughout that entire morning. She simply sat there. The last person called was Dr. Sinclair Voss. Adeline had enough in her hands to destroy him, and she had spent an entire night sitting with those papers in the apartment above the laundromat, deciding what she was going to do with them, and in the end she chose another way. She had her lawyer send him a copy of everything, accompanied by exactly one question: whether he wanted to appear at the hearing as a witness or as the man whose name would be spoken. He came. He stood at the witness podium, his hair far grayer than it had been in the photographs on the medical news pages, and he testified. He confirmed that the signature on the 3rd page was his. He confirmed that he had read the inspection report on the day it was issued, 11 days before that night, and he confirmed that he had been verbally instructed that the recall would be handled at a higher level, and that he didn't need to take any further action. When asked who had given the instruction, he said a name. He didn't look toward Adeline once during his testimony, and she didn't look at him either. Near the end of the session, the presiding member asked a procedural question: whether the petitioner had anyone prepared to testify to her character. Adeline opened her mouth to say that she didn't. Then the door at the back of the room opened. They came in quietly, one by one, dressed in black suits, and filled the entire last row, with 2 men still left standing against the wall. Tobias Renner came in first. Gideon Marsh entered last, and closed the door very gently behind him. Not one of them said a word. No one raised a hand. No one asked to speak. No one was called to the witness stand. They simply remained there for the rest of the morning. 9 men whose names were written in slanted handwriting inside a hardbound notebook its owner still carried in her purse, and the fact that they were sitting there said more than any testimony could have. The decision was read in the early afternoon. Adeline Cross's nursing license was fully reinstated. The previous finding was vacated, and the board stated that it would issue a public correction to be published in the state register. Adeline listened to the entire page without moving. She didn't cry. She sat perfectly still, both hands still resting flat on the table, looking straight toward the platform, while the room settled into the particular silence of administrative chambers. After everything was finished, and people began gathering their papers, then, in the 3rd row, a 58-year-old woman with graying hair rose suddenly to her feet and began to applaud. She clapped alone in the silent room, not quickly, not loudly, only steadily, refusing to stop, and the sound of her hands carried bare and solitary through the low-ceilinged conference room on the 4th floor for 4 or 5 beats before a second person stood. Adeline turned and looked at Bertie Kowalski, and only then did she begin to cry. Everett Halloway was indicted at the beginning of that summer, along with 2 other members of the former executive board of Meridian Health Group, on charges related to concealing inspection results, falsifying internal records, and a chain of financial transactions, routed through 3 legal entities in 2 states. That chain of transactions was what ultimately brought down Casper Lund's operation, because money had to flow somewhere, and it had flowed through the docks he controlled. But for prosecutors to use the financial records Raphael Vitale possessed, he had to testify about where they had come from, and testifying about their origin meant testifying about himself. His private attorney sat with him through an entire night discussing it, and in the end there was only one thing she could say: that she had represented him for many years, and this was the first time she couldn't find a way for him to win. He testified anyway. The sentence was handed down on a September afternoon for a fixed term, and he listened with both hands resting on the wooden table, without moving. There was wind on the courthouse steps that day. The first autumn wind of Boston slipping through the narrow streets and making people pull their collars closed. Adeline didn't cry. She stood in front of him, lifted both hands, and buttoned his long black wool coat, one button at a time, working from the bottom upward. Slowly, until she reached the last one, something no one had ever done for him, and something he had never done for himself. Tobias Renner was waiting at the foot of the steps. He had taken off his suit jacket and folded it over one arm, and he told Rafe that he had just applied to the city's emergency medical technician training program, that classes would begin in January, and that he didn't know how to say thank you the right way. Rafe didn't take the suit jacket back. He removed the watch with the white face and the leather strap worn nearly through at the third hole from his wrist, and placed it in Tobias's hand, and he said it had belonged to his mother, that it lost a little time every day, and that Tobias should remember that when he was out on shift. Many years later, on a summer evening, the warehouse at the end of the dead-end road along the southern docks was no longer a warehouse. Windows had been cut into the eastern wall, the entire interior had been repainted, and above the entrance hung a sign with 3 words on it: Hollis Bright Clinic. It opened from late afternoon until morning, exactly during the hours when the other clinics in the city had already turned off their lights, and no one here asked whether the person walking through the door had insurance. Adeline Cross was the head nurse. Tobias Renner worked the night shift. Nell Renner, now employed by an accounting firm, still volunteered there on weekends and still brought apple pies with the crust burned at one corner. In the waiting room, there was a basket filled with star-shaped stickers, and children sitting beside their parents competed to cover their sleeves with them. And every time Tobias Renner ducked behind the counter pretending he couldn't find one of the children, the entire waiting room erupted in laughter. That evening, the glass door opened. A man stood outside on the threshold, gray beginning to show at both temples, both hands tucked into the pockets of a black wool coat, and he didn't step inside. He stood there looking in the way someone did who had never grown comfortable with rooms that smelled of disinfectant. Adeline walked out to him. She handed him coffee in a paper cup. Then she took his wrist, and she began counting each step aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and on the 9th step, she pulled him across the threshold. In her locker at the end of the hallway, beside the photograph of a woman who had been gone for many years, lay a yellowed ivory piano key on top of a neatly folded cloth. A person's death is never only a line in a report, and the price of silence is always paid by the innocent. There are mistakes that aren't ours, and yet remain on our shoulders for years, and the only thing we can do is refuse to let them turn us into someone else. Because sometimes, what changes an entire life is simply having one person willing to call us by our real name, willing to write down what they heard, and willing to stand when everyone else has chosen to remain seated. If this story touched you even a little, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people around you so that every day you can discover more stories worth hearing. How did you feel about the story of Adeline and Raphael? And if you had been in their place, what would you have chosen? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear what comes from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, happiness, and peace in every day of your life. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.